Hello, we're going to be reading chapter 19 of Farmer Boy today. So get your books and turn to page 228. That's what we're going to be reading. This chapter has quite a few farm tools that you might be unfamiliar with. So I've got some pictures to show you here, and I'll also post them to Google Classroom so that you can see what some of those tools look like, because probably for most of you, you've never seen or heard of them before. Okay, early harvest. Now it was haying time. Father brought out the scythes, and Almanza turned the grindstone with one hand and poured a little stream of water on it with the other hand, while Father held the steel edges delicately against the whirring stone. So the grindstone is what you see in the picture there. This is all a process of getting grain, making hay, and this is what the scythe looks like. So it's a tool that would be used for cutting grass, for example, like with mowing, or it could cut grain. And so it's got this long handle and a blade for it to chop something like grass or grain. So the water kept the scythes from getting too hot, while the stone ground their edges thin and sharp. Then Almanza went through the woods to the little French cabins and told French Joe and Lazy John to come to work next morning. As soon as the sun dried the dew on the meadows, Father and Joe and John began cutting the hay. They walked side by side, swinging their scythes into the tall grass, and the plumed timothy fell in great swaths. Swish, swish, swish went the scythes, while Almanzo and Pierre and Louis followed behind them, spreading out the heavy swaths with pitchforks so that they would dry evenly in the sunshine. The stubble was soft and cool under their bare feet. Birds flew up before the mowers. Now and then a rabbit jumped and bounded away. High up in the air, the meadowlark sang. The sun grew hotter. The smell of the hay grew stronger and sweeter. Then waves of heat began to come up from the ground. Almanza's brown arms burned browner, and sweat trickled on his forehead. The men stopped to put green leaves in the crowns of their hats, and so did the boys. For a little while, the leaves were cool on top of their heads. In the middle of the morning, Mother blew the dinner horn. Almanzo knew what that meant. He stuck his pitchfork in the ground and went running and skipping down across the meadows to the house. Mother met him on the back porch with the milk pail, brimming full of cold eggnog. The eggnog was made of milk and cream, with plenty of eggs and sugar. Its foamy top was speckled with spices, and pieces of ice floated in it. The sides of the pail were misty with cold. Many of you have probably had eggnog before, but not made it. It would be a fun challenge to actually make some of your own eggnog, which is usually something you drink around Christmas time, but he's drinking it in the summertime. Almanza trudged slowly toward the hayfield with the heavy pail in a dipper. He thought to himself that the pail was too full. He might spill some of the eggnog. Mother said waste was sinful. He was sure it'd be sinful to waste a drop of that eggnog. He should do something to save it. So he set down the pail, he dipped the dipper full, and he drank. The cold eggnog slid smoothly down his throat, and it made him cool inside. Then he reached the hayfield. Everyone stopped work. They stood in the shade of an oak and pushed back their hats, and passed the dipper from hand to hand till all the eggnog was gone. Almanza drank his full share. The breeze seemed cool now, and a Lazy John said, wiping the foam from his mustache, "Ah, that puts heart into a man." Now the men whetted their scythes, making the whetstones ring gaily on the steel blades, and they went back to work with a will. Father always maintained that a man could do more work in his 12 hours if he had a rest and all the eggnog he could drink, morning and afternoon. They all worked in the hayfield as long as there was light enough to see what they were doing, and the chores were done by lantern light. Next morning, the swaths had dried, and the boys raked them into windrows with big, light wooden rakes that Father had made. Then Joe and John went on cutting hay, and Pierre and Louis spread the swaths behind them. But Almanzo worked on the hayrack. Father drove it up from the barns, and Father and Royal pitched the windrows into it, while Almanzo trampled them down. So they're throwing up that grain and then trampling it down, making it very compact. Back and forth he ran on the sweet-smelling hay, packing it down as fast as Father and Royal pitched it into the rack. When the rack would hold no more, he was high in the air on top of the load. There he lay on his stomach and kicked up his heels, while Father drove down to the big barn. The load of hay barely squeezed under the top of the tall doorway, and it was a long slide to the ground. Father and Royal pitched the hay into the haymow, while Almanzo took the water jug to the well. He pumped, then jumped and caught the gushing cold water in his hands and drank. He carried water to Father and Royal, and he filled the jug again. Then he rode back in the empty hay rack and trampled down another load. Almanzo liked haying time. From dawn till long after dark every day, he was busy, always doing different things. It was like play, and morning and afternoon there was cold eggnog. But after 3 weeks of making hay, all the haymows were crammed to bursting, and the meadows were bare. Then the rush of harvest time came. So they've collected all that hay that they might use for feeding their cattle, for example. And now it's time for actually getting the good grain that they'd be using for breads, for example. The oats were ripe, standing thick and tall and yellow. The wheat was golden, darker than the oats. The beans were ripe, and pumpkins and carrots and turnips and potatoes were ready to gather. So these are all of the vegetables and things that are ready in the fall time. So in autumn, they're able to get wheat, they're able to get pumpkins, carrots, potatoes, things that are growing in the ground. There was no rest and no play for anyone now. They all worked from candlelight to candlelight. Mother and the girls were making cucumber pickles, green tomato pickles, and watermelon rind pickles. They were drying corn and apples and making preserves. Everything must be saved, nothing wasted of all the summer's bounty. Even the apple cores were saved for making vinegar, and a bundle of oat straw was soaking in a tub on the back porch. Whenever Mother had 1 minute to spare, she braided an inch or two of oat straw braid for making next summer's hats. The oats were not cut with scythes, but with cradles. Cradles had blades like scythes, but they also had long wooden teeth that caught the cut stalks and held them. When they had cut enough for a bundle, Joe and John slid the stalks off in neat piles. Father and Royal and Almanzo followed behind, binding them into sheaves. And you can see what that looks like in the picture next to it as they're bundling it all together. Almanzo had never bound oats before. Father showed him how to knot 2 handfuls of stalks into a long band, then how to gather up an armful of grain, pull the band tightly around the middle, twist its ends together, and tuck them in tightly. In a little while, he could bind a sheaf pretty well, but not very fast. Father and Royal could bind oats as fast as the reapers cut them. So they've got one section of people who are cutting them, and you can see people in this corner of the picture collecting it all, and then several people tying it up into some bundles or the sheaves. In a little while, he could bind a sheaf pretty well, but not very fast. Oh, I read that part already. So just before sunset, the reapers stopped reaping, and they all began shocking the sheaves. So the reapers are the ones who are cutting it and preparing it to be bundled, and then you've got the people shocking the sheaves, which is putting them into those bundles. All the cut oats must be shocked before dark, because they would spoil if they lay on the ground in the dew overnight. So they've got to be sitting or standing upright like that. Almanzo could shock oats as well as anybody. He stood 10 sheaves up on their stem ends, close together with all the heads of grain upward. Once again, so it's the hard stalk on the ground and then the soft oats facing upward. Then he set 2 more sheaves on top and spread out their stems to make a roof over the 10 sheaves. The shocks looked like little Indian wigwams, dotted all over the field of pale stubble. We know what that looks like from history. So that's what happens when they're all little bundles made into one bigger bundle. The wheat field was waiting. There was no time to lose. As soon as all the oats were in the shock, everyone hurried to cut and bind and shock the wheat. It was harder to handle because it was heavier than the oats, but Almanzo manfully did his best. Then there was the field of oats and Canada peas. The pea vines were tangled all through the oats, so they could not be shocked. Almanzo raked them into long windrows. So there are certain things that can be put into that sheave, like the wheat and oats, and others that have to be bundled in a different way. Already, it was high time to pull the navy beans. Alice had to help with them. Father hauled the bean stakes to the field and set them up, driving them into the ground with a maul. Then Father and Royal hauled the shocked grain to the barns, while Almanzo and Alice pulled the beans. First, they laid rocks all around the bean stakes to keep the beans off the ground. Then they pulled up the beans. So they're growing underground and they're pulling them out. With both hands, they pulled till their hands could hold no more. They carried the beans to the stakes and laid the roots against them, spreading the long vines out on the rocks. Layer after layer of beans they piled around each stake. The roots were bigger than the vines, so most of the plant is underground. So the pile grew higher and higher in the middle. The tangled vines full of rattling bean pods hung down all around. When the roots were piled to the tops of the stakes, Almanzo and Alice laid vines over the top, making a little roof to shed rain. Then that beanstake was done, and they began another one. The stakes were as tall as Almanzo, and the vines stood out around them like Alice's hoop skirts. One day, when Almanzo and Alice came to dinner, the butter buyer was there. He came every year from New York City. He wore fine city clothes with a gold watch and chain, and he drove a good team. Everybody liked the butter buyer, and dinner time was exciting when he was there. He brought all the news of politics and fashions and prices in New York City. After dinner, Almanzo went back to work, but Alice stayed to watch Mother sell the butter. The butter buyer went down cellar, where the butter tubs stood covered with clean white cloths. Mother took off the cloths, and the butter buyer pushed his long steel butter tester down through the butter to the bottom of the tub. The butter tester was hollow, with a slit in one side. When he pulled it out, there in the slit was a long sample of butter. Mother did not do any bargaining at all. She said proudly, though, "My butter speaks for itself," meaning he's able to see how quality the butter, the butter is a very good quality just by eating a little bit of it. She doesn't need to work it up and sell it. Not one sample from all her tubs had a streak in it. So there might be a streak if it's not been churned very well. Churning it would cause a good consistency so that it all looks the same. Butter that you would get from the store is probably all the same, and her butter looks like that. From top to bottom of every tub, Mother's butter was all the same golden, firm, sweet butter. Almanzo saw the butter buyer drive away, and Alice came skipping to the bean field, swinging her sunbonnet by its strings. She called out, "Guess what he did?" "What?" Almanzo asked. "He said that Mother's butter is the best butter he ever saw anywhere. He paid her," guess what he paid her? 50 cents a pound. Almanzo was amazed. He'd never heard of such a price for butter. She had 500 pounds. Do the calculation there. 50 cents a pound, 500 pounds. Alice said, "That's $250. He paid her all that money, and she's hitching up right now to take it to the bank." In a little while, Mother drove away in her second best bonnet and her black bombazine. She was going to town in the afternoon on a weekday in harvest time. She'd never done such a thing before. But Father was busy in the fields, and she would not keep all that money in the house overnight. We remember that before. Almanzo was proud. His mother was probably the best butter maker in the whole of New York State. people in New York City would eat it and say to one another how good it was and wonder who made it. Okay, so that was harvest time. A lot of things that probably are not familiar to you, not very familiar to me either, having not grown up on a farm like this. I'll see if I can post some videos of what this process looks like as they're gathering their grains, gathering the beans, and the butter making is very interesting as well. So if I find any on YouTube or elsewhere on the internet, I'll put it up in Google Classroom for you to see the process of what that looks like. Talk to you later. Bye.